Nearly every wrestling fan has seen the blood-soaked face of Mick Foley as Cactus Jack at this point. It's the essence of who he is in the industry. His name, the hardcore legend, tells people he must have been through some heinous battles in his time, and the tales of his exploits in Japan still radiate influence throughout the wrestling world today. The overseas death matches still make for an uncomfortable viewing experience, whereas a horror film with excess gore can be attributed in one's mind to movie magic, where everyone actually goes home safe and sound at the end of the day. These exhibitions of extreme in Japan are as raw and real as it gets, with famous and unknown wrestlers alike suffering shocking injuries for the amusement of the crowd. As Foley laid on the canvas, his flesh burning up and down his arm in front of nearly 30,000 spectators in a baseball stadium an hour south of Tokyo, he must have asked himself, "How did I end up here?" This is the story of how Mrs. Foley's baby boy went from awkward and relatively unathletic teenager to internationally recognized deathmatch king. Growing up on Long Island, Mick Foley had a singular dream, a dream to one day become a professional wrestler that the adoring masses cheered. This dream had existed within himself for many years. However, the day that flipped the switch within his mind occurred at Madison Square Garden on October 17, 1983. An 18-year-old Foley would watch from a few rows behind the ringside barricade as Superfly Jimmy Snuka battled Don Morocco inside a steel cage for the Intercontinental Championship. As Snuka ascended from the top turnbuckle onto the corner of the cage, Foley felt the energy within the crowd rising. Snuka threw the double shaka hand sign into the air and leapt from the top of the cage onto the prone Morocco in the center of the ring. Foley was enamored with the reaction Snuka received, and Mick would later put his body and mind through extreme brutalities to garner the same response for himself. With his heart set on a career in wrestling, Foley faced an uphill battle as he was not a naturally gifted athlete compared to many in the business. He didn't have an eye-catching physique, and he did not have a natural promo delivery. The history of pro wrestling features many characters who were beloved by fans who didn't fit the prototype. Stars like Dusty Rhodes, whose infectious charisma and confidence overcame any doubts fans would have about his body type. Or Abdullah the Butcher, who used terror and blood to mesmerize and frighten audiences. Or late bloomer Diamond Dallas Page, who didn't get his in-ring start in the business until his mid-30s. DDP would say, "If you can't be better than, you've got to be different than." Mick Foley was certainly different than from the very beginning. From eating worms on the lacrosse pitch during high school games to intimidate opponents, or dressing in drag during homecoming, Foley loved getting reactions out of people, regardless of what he needed to put himself through to achieve them. After spending time as an enhancement talent in the WWE as Jack Foley, then later years on the independents, as well as working for Bill Watts' UWF and the Memphis-based Continental Wrestling Association, Mick would go on to find his first significant notoriety in the Dallas World Class Championship Wrestling territory as a member of Skandar Akbar's stable. He would be billed as Cactus Jack Manson. The reference to Charles Manson was not something Foley was supportive of and would later have it dropped. Terry Funk would see Foley for the first time during this run in Dallas. Terry would say, "When I first saw Cactus Jack, he was on Dallas television. Here was this goofy-looking guy in the ring. I thought, my God, they'll stoop to any level to get somebody on." Funk laughed. "Then I watched him, and for some reason I was attracted to him. He was so unusual and so different than any other person in the profession." Foley's style involved taking the majority of the abuse in his matches himself, often in a way that made his fans and peers alike uncomfortable seeing it. Foley would be back body dropped onto the concrete floor near ringside on an almost nightly basis, and his signature move was a running elbow drop he would deliver off the ring apron onto an opponent who was laying on exposed concrete near ringside. Foley would even hit the back of his head on the concrete so hard it would draw blood. He called it the Nestea plunge, something he referred to as bleeding for dollars. Even Foley knew the shocking spot was unsustainable. The stunts weren't the only thing that drew people in. The look in his eye and his unorthodox promos made Cactus Jack must-see entertainment, and he showed the early signs of his ability to get people to care about him, whether they did so in love or hate. The time in Dallas got him recognized by WCW, leading to an offer for him to work for the company. He made his debut on Clash of the Champions 16 in Augusta, Georgia on September 5, 1991, by attacking Sting after coming out of a box placed on the entrance ramp. And in the words of Bruce Pritchard, anyone that comes out of a box is over. In June of the next year, he would face the Stinger for the WCW World Heavyweight title. Foley had managed to climb from an enhancement talent, or a jobber, to feuding with a top star in the business for the world title. Foley would lose the match to Sting, but this would lead to one of his most iconic feuds against Big Van Vader. Vader was infamously stiff, and several wrestlers would outright refuse to work with him, fearing being injured by the mastodon from the Rocky Mountains. The punishing matches against Vader helped to put the hardcore side of Cactus Jack on display for a national audience. Brutal, bloody contest with no disqualification and falls count anywhere stipulations as their norm. Cactus Jack got Vader over as a complete monster, and himself over as one of the toughest and craziest men in the business for what he did to achieve that. While powerbombs on concrete, shoot punches that would lacerate Cactus Jack's face, and stiff chair shots to the head were standard in the two men's highly physical matches, the most enduring injury Mick would come away with from this feud was the night he wrestled Vader in Germany in the spring of 1994, when Foley would lose his ear after being tied up in the ropes, tearing it away from his skull. Foley got out of the rope spot and later threw a punch at Vader. Vader reactively grabbed at the side of Foley's head, and at this moment, the videotape of the match shows the ear precariously falling down onto the canvas. The referee handed the ear to the ring announcer, who went backstage to inform Ric Flair that he was in possession of Mick Foley's right ear. The ear couldn't be reattached at the hospital, but after 4 hours of plastic surgery, the cartilage was restructured around the ear canal to create what now passes for an oddly shaped small ear for Mick. The feud with Vader was disbanded shortly after this, and Foley and Vader were both highly disappointed as it was one of the hottest acts of the time. Unhappy with his treatment in WCW, he left a six-figure contract with the Atlanta promotion and returned to the independents, and spent time in Smoky Mountain Wrestling and Extreme Championship Wrestling. ECW gave Cactus Jack the opportunity to air his grievances about his time in WCW during vignettes and promos, adding a personal side to the character that would not only help him connect with the ECW audience, but lay the blueprint for how Foley would use his combination of shocking hardcore matches and a more fleshed out, empathetic persona that would lead to his cult following by fans. Now back on his own, Mick Foley faced his new reality. He had a mortgage and a young family. He had foregone the guaranteed money of WCW and was feeling the pressure to get his name out in a major way. In the early 1990s in Japan, there were two standout wrestling promotions, All Japan and New Japan. New Japan began in 1972 when the legendary Antonio Inoki split from the Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance. All Japan was created in the fall of that same year when Giant Baba broke away from the alliance as well. These two represented the pillars of Japanese pro wrestling for decades. Atsushi Onita founded Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling in 1989, FMW for short, after spending 3 years out of the ring after suffering a nearly career-ending knee injury slipping on spilt water at ringside. This led to a crossroads in not only Onita's life, but would create a schism within Japanese wrestling that would change the trajectory of the industry forever. Onita spent time living with Terry Funk at the Double Cross Ranch in West Texas when he was down and out after a fallout with a promoter in the Dominican Republic led to Onita being brutally beaten in the office after an event. This would create a personal connection between Funk, Onita, and the hardcore deathmatch events that were coming to Japan. FMW promoted cards with extremely violent matches, featuring barbed wire, electric fencing, fire, and exploding ring death matches. However, there were also top women's wrestlers, blends of martial artists and combat sports backgrounds, and highly technically skilled performers beyond just the extremely gory contest it would become known for. There was usually only one deathmatch style contest a night. It soon became clear that there was a market in Japan for this brand of wrestling, and it began to garner a reputation for this type of card. with increasingly violent gimmick matches featured as upstart promotions competed with one another for media attention. The IWA, International Wrestling Association, was founded in 1994 by Victor Quinones, after his prior promotion folded due to heavy financial losses. Quinones found a partner in Tokyo real estate magnate Tatsukuni Asano. Asano was said to have a net worth of around $500 million and a sadistic streak that involved him personally coming up with some of the most gruesome stipulations imaginable for death matches that often sounded more in line with a Saw film than a wrestling card. In January 1995, Mick took an offer for a 10-day tour of Japan to work for the IWA that would pay him just $3,000. Foley, however, had his sights set on putting the newly formed promotion on the map, as well as imprinting his mark on the industry in a lasting way. On that tour in early '95, in an unheated arena in southern Japan, temperatures just a few degrees above freezing inside the building, Foley had a brutal match against Terry Funk for IWA involving barbed wire, a flaming steel chair that had been soaked in kerosene, and a smoldering hot branding iron that Funk actually used on Cactus Jack during the action. The photos and stories of the unprecedented violence that took place in the contest spread throughout Japanese wrestling media and wrestling newsletters back in the West. Although the bout took place in front of a crowd of merely 150 fans, the shocking photos and accounts from that evening and subsequent tours generated such a significant buzz, Asano would end up booking the massive 30,000-seat Kawasaki Stadium for a mega card that August that would be known as Kawasaki Dream. The card would feature a traditional wrestling contest for the NWA Heavyweight Championship, with Dan Severn taking on Tarzan Goto, as well as a contest for the World Tag Team titles. But the big draw was the first ever King of the Deathmatch tournament. 8 men would battle it out in a one-night single-elimination tournament with increasingly more depraved situations as the evening progressed to see who would be crowned King of the Deathmatch. Foley would write in his book, "We had been on the road for 8 days and had traveled via the Japanese bullet train into the wee hours of the morning. We were awakened after about 5 hours of sleep. I stepped off the bus in front of the dilapidated baseball stadium and knew right away that I was going to be in trouble. It was only 10 in the morning, but the temperature was already over 90 degrees. The humidity was almost unbearable." Kawasaki Stadium had been transformed with 3 rings now set up on the baseball field to allow for quick transitions between contests, as a deathmatch ephemera was removed for safety before it would host its next matchup. The first round of the tournament featured Toronto wrestling legend Tiger Jeet Singh defeating Mark Ganasuke in a barbed wire board and chain match after forcing Ganasuke to submit while being stuck in barbed wire. Terry Funk then defeated Leatherface in just under 9 minutes in another barbed wire board and chain match. Leatherface was now being portrayed by Canadian wrestler Rick Patterson. The original Leatherface who appeared in FMW was Mike Kirshner. He had spent 6 months in jail in Japan for assault, and when he was released formed the Leatherfaces tag team with Rick Patterson. The team only lasted 1 match, however, as Kirshner was upset about being scheduled to lose in his return match. So he ripped a chunk of the bed of nails that was being used in the contest and put it on the throat of his foe before dropping a leg on it. It nearly killed his opponent Ono. He then gave a stiff powerbomb to Ono onto the bed of nails. He was immediately fired after the match. Rick Patterson would once again have the Leatherface name to himself. Shoji Nakamaki would defeat that same Ono who had been powerbombed by Kirshner on the bed of nails previously in his opening round contest to advance to face Cactus Jack in the semifinals. Cactus Jack would advance by overcoming Terry Gordy in a 10,000 pushpin of misery thumbtack match. Gordy had overdosed and spent 5 days in a coma almost 2 years to the day prior to this Kawasaki Dream card. Foley would write that Terry Gordy was a much different person after the coma, and was seemingly unaware that the thumbtack stipulation was even going to be a part of their matchup. Foley told Gordy to hit him as hard as he could during the contest to make the punches look legit. Gordy did just that, and after their first exchange, Foley's eyebrow was filleted open with a veil of blood covering his face. Moments after this exchange, a photo would be taken that would make the cover of Raw magazine's July 1998 Blood, Guts, and Mick Foley issue. Foley took shots to his back from a barbed wire baseball bat during the bout and was powerbombed into a box of tacks by Gordy. As Gordy went to celebrate, Foley grabbed a handful of thumbtacks and threw them in Gordy's face, following it up with Cactus Jack's signature double-arm DDT and the pinfall to move on in the tournament that was just only beginning to show the carnage it had in store. After the match, Foley returned to the back and was surprised to find there was no coffee, water, soda, or any beverages for the wrestlers. Battered and bloody, he walked into the concessions area where an enthusiastic yet surprised fan gladly purchased a sports drink for him. Terry Funk faced Tiger Jeet Singh in the semifinals in a barbed wire board and glass match. They battled for 6 minutes with a significant portion taking place amongst the fans outside the ring as Singh delivered a beating to Funk using the butt of his sword. Singh would strike Funk as he climbed onto the ring apron, sending him into a box at ringside filled with plate glass. As the sound of glass breaking echoed around the stadium, fans' shrieks can be heard audibly on the video. Funk would advance when interference by Cactus Jack would backfire on the man from Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Jack would attempt to strike Funk with the sword, but would end up hitting the butt against Singh's head, allowing Terry Funk to pick up the victory and advance to the finals. Cactus Jack would face Shoji Nakamaki in the semifinals in a bed of nails match. The shocking sight of a bed of nails at ringside can do awful things to one's imagination. There was a nervous hum throughout the stadium prior to this getting underway. Foley would state that, "The thing is, 1,000 nails, okay. 1 6-inch nail can kill you or cause great damage. It's not an illusion, but the more nails you land on, the safer you are. There's a high degree of danger because there's just no guarantee." Nakamaki and Foley had extremely limited communication due to the language barrier, causing even greater risk during the potentially lethal contest. The match would utilize both a bed of nails inside the ring and a board covered in barbed wire. Cactus propped up the bed of nails against the corner of the turnbuckle, rubbing the prone Nakamaki's forehead against the bottom corner of the board. Then Nakamaki shoved Cactus into the nails, pushing into Jack's back and shoulder. As Nakamaki laid outside the ring, Cactus Jack delivered his famous elbow drop off the apron. However, this time his opponent was laying underneath a bed of nails. As Nakamaki attempted to get out from under the nails after the elbow, nails were pushing into his hands and arms as gasps reverberated throughout the crowd in response to the shocking visual. After a back-and-forth 10 minutes that left Shoji Nakamaki covered in his own blood, Cactus Jack hit a double-arm DDT onto the board of barbed wire to mercifully end the contest via pinfall. The finals of the Maiden King of the Deathmatch tournament were now set. Terry Funk would take on Cactus Jack in a barbed wire ropes, exploding barbed wire boards, exploding ring, time bomb death match. Yes, that's a mouthful, and the explosives were from C4. Terry Funk believed that there wasn't enough C4 and encouraged adding additional explosions to the match. Foley was against the idea of adding more C4 and would later regret their involvement. Before the finals took place, the IWA tag titles were on the line as the Headhunters defeated the champions Los Cowboys, followed by the NWA Championship bout with Dan Severn successfully defeating Goto by TKO. This gave Mick and Terry a break before the grand finale, but the atmosphere of this card was different than a traditional wrestling show, with more of a day at the county fair vibe, with significant breaks between wrestling contests, letting them be treated more as the spectacles that they were. Terry Funk and Cactus Jack stood across the barbed wire wrapped ring at the beginning of the final. Did I mention at the 10-minute mark of the match the ring itself was rigged to explode? While that timed explosion would be anticlimactic, the worst was still yet to come. Foley wrote of that final fight. The bell rang and we stalked each other like Rocky and Apollo Creed. Terry flicked a couple weak jabs that grazed my eye and opened my gash slightly. It was tough to get a rhythm going. Barbed wire matches were tough enough, even without the presence of boards laced with explosives in every corner. We tried to use the wire, and we tried to do some moves. We fought outside and used the non-explosive boards, and I even hit Terry with a half-used spool of barbed wire. We rolled back into the ring, and Terry pulled one of the boards in the middle of the ring. Kawasaki Stadium started to buzz. This is what they came to see. With the board set up in the middle of the ring, Cactus landed some stiff shots and knocked Funk onto it, the C4 detonating as he hit. Foley said the concussion of the blast was as disorienting as it was terrifying. Funk writhed in pain on the smoldering board as the referee helped to roll his body off the wire-covered wood. Funk's arm had been badly burned. Cactus went for a cover. Funk kicked out at 2. He was far too tough and too proud to end the agony yet, even with his injuries. Funk sent Cactus into the barbed wire replaced ropes of the ring, and Cactus had the intention of taking the entire side out and crashing to the floor. However, the wire didn't give way and sagged under his weight, cutting into his stomach and ribs. The move was painful, but didn't have the aesthetic quality Foley had hoped for. But it did buy Funk a little time to clear the cobwebs after the explosion. Terry Funk had pulled another C4 and barbed wire board into the middle of the squared circle, and as Cactus pulled himself away from the barbed wire ring ropes, he was met with a hip toss by Funk onto the explosives. Foley was amazed. As he had rolled through the bump on the hip toss, the exploding C4 had just missed causing significant damage to him. Terry would lock in a step-over toe hold, a forgettable move in the U.S., but one that was viewed as dangerous in Japan. Yes, somehow a step-over toe hold still got a big reaction during a barbed wire rope exploding ring deathmatch. The fatigued crowd was beginning to come to life, and just as it looked like this may be the finish of the match, Tiger Jeet Singh showed up to nail Funk once again with the handle of his sword. Singh and Cactus would throw Funk into a wire-covered explosive board head first that would cause the C4 to go off right in Funk's face. As Terry tried to scurry away from the corner, his body had been so entangled in the barbed wire he struggled to get out, grabbing at the barbs with his bloody, taped-up hands. There was less than a minute left before the big explosion around the ring at the 10-minute mark was slated to go off. As the announcer began his 10-second countdown, Cactus slid under the barbed wire ropes to get outside of the ring. Funk struggled to his feet as the announcer continued. 3, 2, 1... Yes, they count down in English. And then, poof. The explosion was a dud. Foley would write, "The 4 explosions that went off looked like Roman candles. The fans didn't just fart on it. It looked like they had smelled a giant fart. Terry just stood up with his arms out to say, 'It's not my fault.' I tried my best to think of a way to save the match and came up with only one solution. Terry had the same idea. The injuries were about to pile up." They used the final C4 wire board. However, this time, Cactus Jack wasn't so lucky. Terry lifted Cactus into the air and dropped him back first onto the explosives. It went off under Mick's arm. He felt like he'd been shot. His flesh had been badly burned. He popped right up in a panic and began to crawl out of the ring. Terry Funk stayed down on the mat. The C4 had gone off right under his tricep, and he was in bad shape himself. Cactus pulled a ladder from under the ring and struck Terry with it. The blood was really flowing down Cactus Jack's face now as he ascended the ladder and delivered a picture-perfect elbow drop onto Funk. Cactus went back up the ladder, but Funk shoved him off onto the barbed wire ropes this time, opening up a significant wound on Cactus's hand. After this spot, Funk would crumple to the canvas, seemingly too injured and exhausted to continue. Cactus would drape his arm over him for the 3 count. The audience was surprised by the finish, but not disappointed. After 3 grueling matches, Mick Foley, Cactus Jack, was the king of the deathmatch tournament. Foley asked backstage about a bonus payout from Asano due to the impressive turnout that day. Asano put a coin in a soda machine and handed him the can and proclaimed, "Cactus-san, bonus." Mick Foley still has that can of soda up in his bathroom to remember his past. RF Video would sell copies of the VHS tapes that would become wildly popular with diehard wrestling fans. Foley would never receive any royalties from those sales, but the legend of Cactus Jack as the Deathmatch King was now undeniable. Foley was in such poor shape on his return flight to JFK Airport, the airline upgraded him to first class. In what would turn out to be one of the greatest Cinderella stories in wrestling history, just over 3 years after that hot August night, Mick Foley would be crowned the WWE Champion.